Welcome to Channel 17, the Town of Colonie Government Channel.
So anyway, the book, The St. Lawrence Seaway and Power Project, an oral history of the greatest construction show on earth, and Claire teaches over at Siena, and she's from up that way. She's from Watertown. So here's Claire to tell us about her book.
Well, thank you. Yikes. It's really like being on camera here. Spot me here. I'll get rid of my water. Well, I appreciate you all coming to see me today. I mean, I'm among fellow upstaters. Actually, I should say northern New York. We're not upstate, we're northern, right?
North country.
We're God's country. That's what they all say about us, right? If you live there in many respects. But here, I'll stop this here. Let me see if I can get this to do what I need it to do. 3 days to figure out. I appreciate you coming to hear me talk about my book. It's obviously about the St. Lawrence Seaway and Power Project. And I always like to start off my presentation. People always ask me who I am and why I got interested in this topic. Because depending on where I speak about it, most people have absolutely no idea what the St. Lawrence Seaway and Power Project is. I always say to people, if this was in Canada, they would probably know more than I do. That's just the way it is. But I always like to give people a little bit of a background about how I got involved in the research, give you a little bit about a background about the important parts of the project, and then get to the really fun part of the presentation, and that's what the men and women who are up there for some 8 years had to say about the project, and also very candidly what they had to say about living in Messina in the 1950s. And when we all reconvene up there on July 9th, it's going to be an experience. Many of them are coming back for the first time in 50 years. Many of them I have not met face to face because of where they're located across the country. I spoke with them over the phone. So it's going to be a very interesting weekend. And they're telling me that they can have just as much fun now as they did 50 years ago. So very interesting. But in terms of who I am, I got my degree in political science from St. Lawrence University in 1990. I'm originally from Watertown, New York. And the way I got involved in this research project was in a very accidental way. I had never been to the Seaway when I was growing up. I lived in Watertown my whole life. I'd never been to the Power Dam. I'd, of course, seen the Thousand Islands, but as many of the people who worked on this project told me, we don't really consider that the Seaway. That's kind of a little far away for us. That was a dredging project. That wasn't the really big stuff. But what happened was I needed to fulfill a requirement at St. Lawrence. I needed to take a research seminar. And the St. Lawrence University Library Archives had gotten a collection from various people on the St. Lawrence Seaway. Some people had donated their letters, some people had donated photographs, other people had donated newspaper clippings. And they saw the opportunity for cheap labor, and that was my seminar that I took. No one had gone through it, no one knew what documents were there. And they assigned each of us a different aspect of it. Someone got the technological part, some people got the economic analysis of it and whether it's profitable now. And luckily I, after doing a little bit of wheeling and dealing, got the worker part of it. They had 10 workers that were willing to talk to me about it. And I was supposed to interview these workers and take what they told me and compare it to what was published in the newspapers. So it was very exciting for me, but I sort of put it aside. I thought an awful lot about what several of the gentlemen had told me about friends that they had witnessed dying on the project, telling me what life was like in Messina that really, to be honest with you, at that point I couldn't comprehend. Telling me that it was so prosperous and telling me what the future of the area was supposed to be like. Going to college up there, I couldn't quite see it. So I put it aside, and when I went to get my doctoral degree at Binghamton, I thought I had a really good dissertation topic. I thought that my advisor was a labor historian. I thought, great, I'm going to be able to convince him of the merit of this project. Nothing doing. He told me that if I wanted to do this once I became a famous scholar, that so be it, but I wasn't going to be able to defend this to him or anyone else, so I better find something else to do. So he suggested that I might want to do a comparative history of Messina and Cornwall, which was a little bit far away from my initial topic, but I agreed. Wanting to get my degree, I agreed. And what's ironic about all of this is that he is the gentleman who has written the blurb on the back of my book. So there was somewhat of a method to his teaching skills, I suppose. But what I used my first book for was I used it as an opportunity to really be able to find the people that I had always wanted to interview. When people called me to do a book review of my first book, they said, "What's next?" And I said, well, I'm thinking this is my opportunity. Throw my email address out there, my phone number. I said I've always, for the last, at that point it was 11 years, wanted to interview men who worked on the St. Lawrence Seaway. And I thought because it had been 50 years removed, I might get a few people, 4 or 5 people. Well, what I found out was even if the individuals themselves didn't want to contact me, their children did. Because if they put it, they'd heard it all, over and over and over again for the last 50 years, and someone, please someone, had to put it in writing so that they didn't have to pass it on themselves to their children, that somebody had to document it. So I got a lot of emails from children. You've got to talk to my father. You've got to talk to my mother. Because in many cases, the husband had passed away. And that's how I started to interview the wives as well. So it was a very interesting process. Interviewed 53 people. Probably could have interviewed about 200, really, if I had had the time and the pages. But I was limited to 500 pages, so this is what it ended up being. But there are many more people out there who worked on this project and made a major contribution to it. So I'm honored to be their voice, and I was honored to be able to interview them and put their words into print. And it was quite a task. That's another whole talk about transcribing it and finding them and all of that. But it's been a pleasure, and the reaction that I've gotten has made it all very worthwhile. But enough about me. I'm going to switch my slide here and give you a little bit of an overview here. It's a very inadequate map is the best way to put it. I have said to the Seaway Development Corporation many times, do you not have a better map? And they'll send me something that is even harder to understand than this one. Because to them, telling people about where the seaway is not important. It's getting people to put ships on the seaway. So I kind of had a difficult task here. But what this does is it gives you obviously a very good viewpoint of where it's located. The part that's boxed off here, if I can point to it here, this is the part that the people worked on that I interviewed. Yes, there have been dredging operations and other things that have taken place, but for the sake of this book, I was limiting myself to where this construction took place, basically from Montreal all the way out toward the Welland Canal, and you can go all the way through the Great Lakes and consider that part of the seaway. But this is always very difficult for me. I tell people where it's located, and the very interesting thing about this project, and you can see it at the very top of the map, it's 5 sections up there at the top. Construction took place on all 5 of these sections simultaneously between 1954 and 1959. It was the job of the water level engineers, Keith Henry on the Canadian side and his counterpart on the American side, to keep everything from flooding, to make sure they were dredging at the right level, that they were controlling the river at the right level. And it's a very unique project because it is a combination of 2 things. It's a power dam and it's a waterway. So they had to figure out how to keep the current for power production, but they also had to figure out how to get around it so that ships can navigate it. So it was a very comprehensive, complex project that many people thought, even when they started building it, wasn't even possible. that it was just too difficult to do. And what this book really shows is not only the ability of the people to design it, but the laborers and the workers to do it. They were willing to sacrifice their lives in many cases and to make this happen. One of the things that's really interesting to hear is the way that other authors refer to the Seaway, and I'll just share that with you briefly. It's been referred to as one of the 8 wonders. They say the 8th wonder of the world. They say that it defied comprehension, and if you've ever been up there and stood at the top of that power dam, you can't do that anymore. Had to be there before September 11th. Even now, to me, it defies comprehension. The size of it, the ability that all of it still functions after 50 years is mesmerizing. A gentleman wrote a book called The Seaway Story, and he summed it up very well. He said, the job was diverse. It meant seizing land, lifting bridges, moving houses, railways, and factories out of the way. It meant building canals, dikes, dams, and locks, and it meant replanting old towns and creating entirely new towns. All of this at the same time with a very, very slim time period. So it was a major, major undertaking. This is the only statistical slide that I put up here. And it's one of the things that when I put it up here, particularly people who aren't aware of the Seaway are amazed at. A couple of things up here. The fact that the governments of the United States, Canada, New York State, and the province of Ontario all cooperated during this time period is amusing. As I mentioned, for the 50th celebration, they're doing it on 2 separate weeks. They can't even agree to that now. The agencies up there, Ontario Hydro, the province of Ontario, the Power Authority of the state of New York, the Corps of Engineers, all of these had to cooperate. They had to meet every week. They had to make sure that the projects, the facilities that they were working on were on schedule. And they played unbelievable golf tournaments too. That's all I know. On Friday afternoon, if you could find any engineer on the project, you were lucky. That's what they tell me. The dates of construction, 1954 to 1959, they were producing power a year earlier than the navigation route was finished. It was supposed to take 10 years. But when Robert Moses got involved, if anybody knows anything about the bulldozer, Robert Moses, it was going to get done within his time frame, whether the Corps of Engineers could design it that way or not. He needed to move on. He needed to pay his bondholders back, so they were going to do it. Equipment, materials, $75 million just in equipment alone. Some of the highest tech equipment at that time, some that came as far away as Kentucky. They dismantled it and brought it up there. Now here's the comparison up here is, I put it up here for one particular reason, and that is the fact that you can see from some of these statistics that it is superior to the Panama Canal. However, where it is not superior to the Panama Canal is where the trouble lies in the present day. Obviously, it's longer. And if you go the full length that people officially say it's 265 miles, this is the construction area. This isn't, sailing from one end to the other. The lock size, as you can see, is a bit of an issue. 800 by 80 feet versus 400 by 110. This is something that recently has come to light. The locks, the Snell and the Eisenhower Lock, which I'll get to in a minute, which were the only 2 on the American side, were actually excavated to be 100 feet. And the workers always told me, they were told midway through the project that they were going to make them only 80, and they never knew why. They dug it, why did they make it smaller? Well, recently it's come out that the American government made a deal with the Canadian shipping industry because, as you well know, you can't fit an ocean-going vessel down the Seaway. It has to be unloaded onto a Canadian shipping vessel. So it held their monopoly there. If it had been made big enough, ships would have been able to go right into the Seaway, right off the ocean. This is one of the problems they have now. It was obsolete before it was even finished. The other thing is the channel depth. It's almost double on the Panama Canal. And the way it is dredged is a very strange way. You don't want to go too far either way on the Seaway because it's very shallow in certain areas. So they didn't dredge it like a bathtub. They dredged it in an angled way because of the material they encountered, and also because of the time period. It had to be done 5 years at maximum because they were going to be moving on to Niagara Falls. So there are problems here. And it's one of the things when I talk to both the Power Authority and the Seaway Authority now, they say, please broadcast the deficiencies here because we need the money to fix it. So they're more than happy to talk about this in the present day. They don't hide it. This next slide, probably the central part of the Seaway and Power Project. It is the Robert Saunders Power Dam. Fascinating structure. You cannot get out there anymore because of September 11th. The only two individuals who are allowed to walk the power dam are two guards. One starts at the American side, the other starts at the Canadian side, and they walk to the middle, which is where the international border is. They say hello to each other and they turn around and go back. But I had the privilege, as I'm sure many of the people who are here today did, to stand right at those top windows there. That's where the observation deck is. You had the ability to look directly across that dam, which is the size of 4 football fields. It's enormous. It's probably the most impressive thing I've ever seen when they open the gates. It's to give you official statistics, it's 3,230 feet long. It's 167 feet high, a lot of which is buried because you cannot see where the turbines are. Interesting thing about this is it was built half by the Americans, half by the Canadians, and they met in the middle. So they hoped. It is also built completely differently. Different turbines, different concrete pours, everything. But you can't see that the way the water covers it now. But I want to share a quote with you here, brief quote from the supervisor on the Canadian side of the power dam. He said, the Canadian side of the power dam had to be built and we had to meet the Americans halfway. Our biggest concern that was once each side was completed, they wouldn't line up. He said, when I arrived on the power dam site, Ontario Hydro officials had a firm completion date and a lot of concrete to pour. I was told that no matter what, it needed to be finished on time. I worked 114 days without a day off. And we only shut down for 2 or 3 days in the winter. We could pour concrete in any temperature and any wind. We actually hired someone just to heat the concrete. I also changed the old system of pouring concrete, and many of the older supervisors didn't like it. I built a new concrete form that was 25 by 25 feet. The Americans usually did about 5-foot pours, up to about 8. It had to be put in place with cranes, and my boss told me I could use the new form if I was willing to risk losing my job if it failed. My new design, I'm proud to say, allowed us to finish 2 months ahead of schedule, and when I assumed my position with the Iroquois constructors, they were a month behind. He's the gentleman whose picture you will see at the end in the memories, and he's also in the photo on the cover of the book. So he was very integral in building the power dam. Now the next slide that I have coming up here is a very interesting structure. I think one of the most fascinating structures I've ever seen constructed. And there are many problems with it. This is what is called the Tsu Control Dam. And what it does is it controls the flow of water into the power pool and into the power dam. But the way this picture is set up, you're only seeing half of it. It was built half at a time as well. They built one half and let the water through. They cofferdammed off the other side and built it. But 2 of the gentlemen I interviewed had an interesting comment about this structure. Because of the way it curved, there was a big concern about it, because most control dams are straight across. There's one that's coming up in a minute that went straight across. One gentleman's job, and I have to thank him for the pictures, he's no longer with us, a gentleman by the name of Alfred Millette, was a National Geographic photographer after this. He surveyed it. Another gentleman I interviewed, by the name of Joe Marmo, was the one who was put in charge of making sure that his measurements were correct. So Al Millette told me he got a phone call one day, and he said they were worried this dam was not going to reach. And he said, well, what's 3/4 of an inch? He said, you don't know what you're visualizing here. So this is what Joe said in response to this. He said, when I first began working on the Seaway project, I had to do the reduction of all the surveyor's notes. And one day the project manager came in and he told me, Joe, you got to come with me. There's something bothering me. He took me up on the embankment on the mainland to view where the Long Tsu Dam was going to be curved to fit an island. He said, it looks like the way that thing is curving, Joe, it's not going to hit the island at all. I replied, you've got to be kidding. Then I realized he was right. I ran back to the office. We had never worked on such a large river and specifically did not comprehend how water can distort your perception. I spent the next week going over every single one of, and he didn't know I talked to him, Al Millette's notes. And when I was finished, I said, Frank, it has got to hit that island. Can't find anything wrong. Just went over everything. And he turned to me and he said, well, I hope you're right. And as you can see, it did work. But this was obviously very difficult. Even the connection there is very, very small. But it was something that had never been done before. It was something that had been designed and looked good on paper, but they didn't necessarily know was going to work. And it was also one of Al Millette's favorite things to photograph. This one as well, the Iroquois Dam, further down toward Waddington. This is an important structure because it controls the water flow of the Great Lakes. The thing about this dam is that most people think that it should not be there. As you can see, the gates, walk over here instead of pointing to you. See, the gates are open down there. People drive their boats through there, even now. When I was home recently, they had shut the gates because of the high level of the lakes because of the snow runoff and the rain. But their biggest concern was that they wanted to let boaters know that the gates were closed. But one of the things that's happened, and I talked to a gentleman, Keith Henry, who did he was a hydrographic engineer. He dealt with all the water levels. He said, there's something that we don't understand, he meant me, about the Great Lakes. And that is that they have storms on the Great Lakes that actually can flood all the way to Montreal. And one of these occurred when they were building the Iroquois Dam and the Seaway. What happened was the water level rises based on barometric pressure, based on earthquakes, all of this. And it flooded. It went right over the top of where this construction was, and it flooded Montreal. And he had to rush back to Montreal. They had to figure out how to get the water out and how to control it, because as he put it, we hadn't finished it yet. We'd fiddled with Mother Nature, but we hadn't fiddled with it completely yet. And even now, there is that danger of doing that. If they cannot, control the water flow, and they have to think very, very quickly because it comes on without warning. So that's one of the main reasons for this. Other structures that I have up here, the Snell Lock is on here, as is the Eisenhower Lock. These are the two locks that were built on the American side. You can still go to the visitor center at the Eisenhower Lock and see them raise and lower ships. But these locks were very important because they bypassed the power dam. They built a channel so that boats could be raised and lowered and bypass power production. But they are, as I'll get to in a minute, two of the structures that are suffering the most, not only from size, but because of concrete deficiency. They dewater them every year and try to repair the concrete, but they're two of the structures that probably will have to be either rebuilt or completely rehabbed within the next 5 to 10 years. And they were two of the locks that we held on to. All the other locks are on the Canadian side. And many people argue maybe we shouldn't have held on to them. Maybe they knew a little bit better about cold weather and concrete pouring than we did. Maybe we should have let them have them because they would have to deal with the rehabilitation. The other thing that they had to deal with, and you can see it on here before this comes up, is they had to build an awful lot of channels. This had been a waterway that had been full of rapids before. Boats had used a canal that was alongside. So they had to use an awful lot of ingenuity when it came to dredging because they encountered many materials they had never seen before. Many people did not realize, unless they were natives of that area, that there had actually been glaciers up there. And there's this great material called glacial till, which is like glass when it's hard. And it completely changes, it shatters, it's not easy to dig. They also have marine clay up there, which the stories of what happened to truckers when they put the marine clay in as a liquid and then it decided to dry when they were driving, are just, the stuff that good stories are made of. But they had to figure out how to deal with this, and they had to learn how to deal with it during the project. They had not done enough test borings of the soil and the material, so they were really dealing with this. And basically, Robert Moses said, when they came to him for more money, he said, "You just got to do the job. We'll pay you later." And of course, many of the contractors went bankrupt because of that. And it's one of the reasons if they ever tried to further dredge, they would still have a problem. You can dynamite it, but it's not the easiest stuff to deal with even now. The other thing that I will mention before I get into a little brief thing about the workers is there was something that happened on this project, but predominantly on the Canadian side. And it's something that I couldn't leave out of this book. And whenever I go up to Cornwall, I always am asked questions about it. There is something called the Lost Villages on the Canadian side. 22,000 acres of land were flooded. Towns were completely underwater, and houses had to be moved. This is something that people argue, even though Robert Moses managed to get some people to give up their land, would not necessarily have flown too well on the American side. Physically moving houses, having to compensate people for that, probably would not have been as easy of a job as it was on the Canadian side. But I talked to several gentlemen, one who worked on the house moving, fascinating operation, machine designed almost exclusively for this project. They moved houses completely with all of their furniture, all of their belongings, and nothing moved. One woman, they have a picture of her sitting in a rocking chair. So it's amazing. They have a film that was shot of it. The other thing is that they had to move cemeteries. One of the gentlemen I interviewed was a tour guide on the Canadian side for Ontario Hydro, and he shared this very interesting story with me. He liked to take out VIPs, as he called them, to show them what was really going on the Canadian side. And he knew that there was a whistle at the paper mill that went off every day at noon. So he would make sure that he got the tour to one of the cemeteries about 10 of 5 of 12. And he would tell them all about how they were trying to locate the families. If not, the headstones were going to be moved, some of them to Upper Canada Village. Some people are buried in the Seaway. They put rocks over the top and left them there. But he'd give all this stuff, and he said all of a sudden the whistle would blow, and the heads would pop out from up from one of the graves that they were digging out. The guys would come out, grab their lunch pails, and sit on the edge of the grave that they were digging. And the people he was giving a tour to would just sort of stare at it and really not comprehend this. And his comment was, it was odd to see such a normal activity taking place in such a nonchalant manner, in an eerie setting. These grave diggers were paid $1 an hour higher than the current laborer's rate to take on this grim but necessary task. So it's just one of the things that is extremely unique to the Canadian side, and one of the things that they all remember. None of them wanted that job. None of them wanted to lose their current job and have to go do that because they were afraid of what they might encounter. But it was necessary. They had to move what they could of the grave. So it's a thing that they all bring up, and they're going to light this with lights on the 50th anniversary where these villages used to be in the water. So very interesting. Now, not to downplay the digging up of graves, but there are a lot of other dilemmas that people ran into if you know anything about the weather up in Messina. It can be 95 degrees and humid in the middle of the summer. It can be 50 below with a gale force wind in the winter. It is both extremes. And this is what wreaked havoc, not only with the workers, but the machines, the concrete. And what is interesting is the Canadians thought that it was relatively warm. As they said to me, we worked out in BC, we worked out in the middle, this is south for us. So we had developed concrete that could sustain the cold temperatures. We had workers who would work in this type of weather. You Americans just, you're just so used to it being warm. And many of them were Southerners. So to them, they lasted about, some said 6 months, and once it got cold, that's when the locals all got jobs. They just sort of waited, and they were hired even if they were 14 or 15 years old because everybody else left. The other problem with the weather on the American side is the concrete. And I mentioned this earlier. Something happened with the concrete on the American side that they didn't have on the Canadian. We ran out of concrete. It was after the Korean War, and it was very, very difficult to get a lot of things. Steel, the locks they found out did not have enough rebar in them, and steel. It's one of the reasons why they had to repair them. They had to repair the doors. But they also, if you go and see them now, they look like they have a very bad complexion. They look like they need a good dermatologist. They're flaking and scaling because they used natural cement. And they allowed them to use natural cement to compensate for the fact that they didn't have Portland cement. And this is a big problem. Even if you mix concrete for your sidewalk, how much sand, how much mix, the size of the rocks, all of that plays in, as does the weather. And what the problem was with the lock was they would cover them with hay on the American side. Canadians tarped theirs. They had this really cool heating system. But you can't put hay on the edge of a lock. It's not going to stick, and it's not going to work because the water's going to take it away if it's. So they couldn't cover the edges that are now crumbling. They also did not have enough concrete inspectors on the American side because the Corps of Engineers was running out of money. And one of the concrete inspectors told me, we had one person for the whole project. The Canadians had one person per pour. So it was very, very difficult to do. In the end, the Power Authority became legendary. Their highest final claim after the project was over with was they paid $8 million to the Perini Corporation for cost overages and work that they made them do that initially hadn't been in the design. This is one of the things that the workers, as I'll put up here, had a problem with as well. Not only laborers, but engineers and designers. The plans for the Seaway were not finished when construction started. They were still revising plans that had been put into place in 1941. And because the U.S. passed the bill so quickly and so close to when construction started, they were changing plans all the time. If something didn't work, they changed it. They were 6 days ahead of construction. And according to one of the workers, they had just stacks and stacks and stacks of plans. And every time there was a change made, the contractors argue, well, that change affects this part, and that affects that part. So they had some very interesting claims at the very end. So a very interesting thing to deal with. They also worked not only in bad weather, but also around the clock. They could work 3 8-hour shifts if they wanted to. The project had to be done, and if they were willing to do it, if they were willing to stay awake, then they were more than welcome to do that. They also had to learn how to deal with how the weather affected not only people, but their equipment. The cold would snap some of the equipment in half. It would also do some very interesting things to oil and to the tracks of some of the equipment. It would freeze to the ground. And they had to figure out how to deal with that. And many times, the contractors were nowhere to be found. As they put it, we blowtorched it, we put whatever mix we could figure out. And the equipment that left this place usually left it being dragged or in pieces because we wrecked it just about as good as you could. So it was quite a thing. They had to find mechanics who knew how to fix their trucks and their equipment. The other thing that they all talked about, and it was one of the things that really drew me back to this, was those who gave up their lives for this project. It's something that was not that well publicized, and as I was told, if you didn't die on the project, if you died a couple of weeks later from pneumonia, it didn't count. You had to physically die at the lock or at the dam for the statistics. And a lot of these deaths were due to the height of the dams. It was due to exhaustion. It was due to inexperience. But the gentleman who told me about the graves, his tours, also told me about safety. Because what he did after he left the Seaway project was he worked on safety for Ontario Hydro. And he said, many men working on the Canadian side of the power dam met an untimely death. It wasn't revered, and it was not like it was unexpected, because the safety standards and the safety rules for construction at that particular time existed, but were seldom informed. Heck, men worked on the power dam and town sites without hard hats. They wore fedoras, and you can see it in a lot of the pictures. Many masons did not wear eye protection, and many of the painters have died based on the epoxy and other chemicals because they had a rag to tie around their face. He said that he remembered one incident that would stay with him forever. A gentleman lost his balance and fell about 50 feet. And pardon this is him. He became impaled on a rebar. We extricated him and put him in the ambulance with the rebar right through him, and he died 10 years later. 10 hours later. 10 hours, sorry. 10 days, would you please? 10 hours. That was one of the more serious ones I was involved with, but there were many others. There was one gentleman that would make us always remember. He ended up in a wheelchair for the rest of his life because of a fall, and we had to see him on the streets of Cornwall for the remainder of his life, and it reminded him of what it took to build this. He said, so a lot of men made sacrifices. The total number of fatalities will probably never be known. Men went beyond the call of duty to get the job done. Contractors successfully completed the Seaway and Power Dam, but some of their employees met their demise. So it was, there were many things that occurred, and it was one of the things that was obviously very difficult about the interviews, but it also pays tribute to those who didn't make it off the project, those who I couldn't talk to. So it was an important part of it. The other important aspect, before I get to what they all have to say about where the Seaway is going to go in the next 50 years, was about the women, their wives. This was a chapter that I adamantly fought to keep in my book. It was something that my publisher thought did not matter. It was supposed to be a book about workers. And my argument was, well, you know the old adage, behind every man there's a great woman. And also I wanted to talk about them because they had, their lifestyle was something that I could really understand. They had young children, as do I. They wanted to have a career. They were trained to be veterinarians. They were trained to be nurses. But that was not what they could do at this point in their lives. And many of them have never forgotten it, nor have they let their husbands forget it. And they had to live a very different lifestyle than other women. They were moving every year. Sometimes they didn't even get to go with their husbands. They were left at home with the children when their husbands went to the middle of nowhere for a year. And as they put it, they hoped that they were behaving. They also had a very difficult time moving to Messina. Not only were they dealing with mother-in-laws who didn't want them to be professionals, but as they put it, they were dealing with an area of the world that was like no other. They said that it was like moving to the frontier. They said that it was, the attitude about outsiders was very distrusting. And one of the reasons why it was distrusting was, before they moved to Messina, there were an awful lot of articles that were written in the paper about what had happened on other projects. Things like prostitution, things like crime and public drunkenness. So they were anticipating the worst. One of the workers said, we were too busy to drink, and if we did it on the site anyway because we were always there. And another worker said, we didn't need to pay for prostitution because the women were very friendly and their husbands were busy as well. So I just sort of took that as I would and said, okay. But, you know, they did really have a difficult time of it. One of the women, I love it, says, she talks about moving to the area, and she complained the whole time. All she did, they were 90 miles from everywhere, isolated, culture shock. And then she said, I'll tell you, when we got in the car in 1961 to leave, I said, thank God we're finally leaving here. Those were my thoughts. I was so relieved. It was a fantastic experience for our husbands, but evidently not for their wives. So it was a very, others, and this is, I think, was very interesting to talk to them about. Many of them still live near each other. Their spouses have passed away, and they are still kept in contact with each other. They said, you have to think about the type of lifestyle that we had. We moved all the time. We weren't near our mothers, our sisters, our aunts, our cousins. We had to figure out how to make a life for ourselves, and our life was other workers' wives. We had bridge parties. We took care of each other's children. We learned to live this lifestyle, and as they said, we learned to live with those who couldn't handle it so well. They said it took some of us tough women who were used to this type of lifestyle. But they talked about it. They said we had aunts, we had mothers, we had surrogate people, and they still, 50 years later, still feel that way. So it was obviously a very meaningful time for them. Most of them were in their mid to late 20s and early 30s. Most of them had 4 or 5 children. As they said, it was the winter up there. We all kept saying the last one was going to be our last one, and we would go and play bridge, and well, we all had tail enders, as they called them. So they had to experience a lot. The last thing that I want to share with you is the memories that the workers shared with me. And here's the photo up here. This is the photo. This is him in the photo. This is him now. He was the gentleman who was the supervisor on the Ontario Hydro side. But all of them said the same thing about the Seaway, whether they were 15 or whether they were 45. There was just something about this project. It was exciting. It was different. At the time when it was built during the Cold War, they thought that they were doing their duty to the government. They were doing their duty to Canada or to the United States. This was something that was monumental. And many of them had come out of World War II. Some had gone and fought in the Korean War and then come back to work for the Corps. But to them, they were participating in something important. And Joe Marmo, he was just up there in the film with his wife, said, "My friends and I who worked on the Seaway and Power Project were part of the greatest generation. We had been through hell in our lives already, as Depression babies and World War II veterans. Many of us were much more mature than some of our high school classmates and just appreciated a nice job and a good place to live. I worked with a lot of skilled engineers, carpenters, and machine operators, people from all over the world who had worked on hydro projects in South America and who had southern accents and lifestyles that were different from mine. But we had to work together. I developed some really valuable job and life skills, and I learned how to trust other people. We all had to cooperate with each other to complete the Seaway and Power Project on time." Now, the last question that I asked all of them, and this was another part that my publisher didn't want, but I insisted on putting it in. They didn't want to necessarily know their memories, and they also didn't necessarily want to know their predictions about the future of the Seaway. But I thought, well, why not? They built it. They know what went into it. They know the flaws, because many of them got phone calls out of the blue 2, 3 years later about why the doors were sticking, or did they know anything about the concrete when they were working on it. So as they put it, many of them never left the Seaway behind. Another gentleman who worked on the rehabilitation until 1984 said, I really never left it behind. I was up there every winter, and we probably still will be. So there's just parts of it that are just part of their lives. But I asked them, at 50, what does the future hold? And I'm sure they will have much more to tell me on July 9th. I'm sure that when this part of my presentation comes up, I may just have to take a seat because they are all going to have very much to say for the remainder of them. The gentleman who told me this was a truck driver from Rochester. He passed away about 6 weeks ago. He owned a trucking company, and he brought his trucks up there every winter because nobody wanted to work up there. And he really did not enjoy his time up there much, and he wasn't ashamed to tell me about it. As he put it, I spit on the "You're leaving Messina" sign as I left because I was more broke than when I went up there. This is what he had to say about it. He said, the Seaway had many problems right after it was completed. Since there is only one lock for ships going both ways, this can create long lines and delays. Also, with the current that the ship captains are unfamiliar with, many times they will slam against the lock walls and take a piece of concrete with them as a souvenir. Now engineers are talking about adding new locks that could be wider and longer. They make it bigger today, the traffic on the Seaway could increase. And this is his comment, and this is what I will leave you with. He said, the Seaway opened up the Great Lakes and brought ships to the heart of the country, and that is what makes this country great. The men who designed the project and worked with me and under me are unsung heroes. We worked in horrible conditions and never asked for nothing. Today, I don't think there are dedicated and skilled workers who would go through what we did to upgrade that facility, and that is a shame. The U.S. needs to do something to remain on top. I just don't know if the government or the environmentalists are willing to let that happen. The Seaway will probably crumble until it is useless before the politicians can agree on how to improve it. But, I just want to leave you with the thought, it's the 50th anniversary this year, and one of the workers said to me, it's lasted 50 years, and that's a testament. He said, and that some of us walked away from it and could still talk about it, that's a testament as well. But one of the things that I find extremely gratifying about it, and a worker wrote me a letter the other day, and he said, you are bringing the St. Lawrence and Seaway and Power Project to the next generation. That even though the last 50 years have been somewhat ignored, maybe the next 50 years won't be. That this is a type of worker and a type of job that will never be replicated. So hopefully, I have given them just a little bit of their time in the sun, and I have kept most of myself out of the book, which was a welcome thing. But I also have to thank these gentlemen. They educated me on many things like rebar and concrete and water levels and models and all of this stuff that I, as a historian, did not understand. But they wanted to make sure that when I wrote this book that I got it right and that I had everything accurate about them. So hopefully I have done them some justice here, and they seem to be satisfied. So I appreciate you listening to me, and if you have any questions, more than welcome to answer questions for you. Yes?
Why is it that the Canadians didn't collaborate with the United States on the concrete so that they would have it made the right way? And did we pay for it all, or did the Canadians pay for their half?
And okay, we actually paid half and half. The cost was split evenly between the two. The thing about the concrete is it was the design. They each designed their side of the concrete, the dam separately. So even the pores, even the turbines are made by different companies. And they tell me if you drained it, you would see it. You would see the difference, that the checkerboards don't really even meet up because they would just keep pouring and pouring and pouring and pouring. In terms of the concrete issue, they did ship some over to the American side, but we were a little bit egotistical, is the best way to put it. They probably would have shared with us, but we thought we knew better. We thought that our forms were better. We thought our design was better. And even though we cooperated with a lot of things, if one of the workers told me, if you got caught on the American side without permission or without your pass, you had to have a pass, that you got pulled over by the security guards. They were only supposed to look at each other's construction when permission was given. So it's kind of bizarre. I mean, they had all the technology. They've had no problems with their concrete because they knew how to deal with it. But, you know, as I said, they can't coordinate their 50th anniversary, so the fact that they didn't share concrete secrets is, you know, amazing to me. But if you look at what they did on the Canadian side, it was unbelievable. They tarped the whole thing off. They had a heating system. They heated the concrete. They had the mixture, right? They had a whole lab where they did the mixtures, and it was just amazing scientifically what they could do back then. What I'm hoping for now is that they can use that technology to repair our locks that are crumbling, and maybe we should bring them over, and to help would be a good idea.
How has the tonnage held up over the years? Total tonnage?
It's gone down. Yeah, it goes down, and I think it will continue to go down because in order for it to go up, they'd have to have shipping year-round. And the ice breaking issue is, they produce power year-round, which is where the profit is. But the tonnage, I think, is going to continue to go down, not only because of the ship size, but also because of where industry is. There isn't really the population or the manufacturing in the Great Lakes anymore to get the raw materials or to send it out. What they're sort of hoping on the Seaway is that people are going to start reverse migration, that people are going to move out of the cities and move back to the rural areas, and somehow that's going to change the Seaway. But it's, you know, one gentleman wrote it was obsolete before it was even built. So they are lucky that it can take the ships that it can. The one thing that I didn't mention, and it's kind of an interesting thing, there are two things that they knew could go up the Seaway: submarines and Navy destroyers. They were the two things that went in there before the Seaway was even completed, because one of the thoughts was during the Cold War, this is a completely inland waterway. If you shut off the access to it on one end, you could store an awful lot of submarines, ships. You could protect shipping in and out at that time. So they made sure that it was deep enough for that. And they still play war games up there every once in a while, so I hear. You got it, and they're very interesting.
Somewhere I've read that the original idea, the concept, came out of from Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the 30s.
Mm-hmm.
Is that
yes.
true?
Yeah, it started actually in 1895 was the first time the Seaway itself was proposed. And it went through many changes. First, they thought that the Canadians could build it all on their side. There also was an idea to build it further south, that maybe you might be able to use the Hudson and hook it up internally in the U.S. There was some debate about that. But where Franklin Roosevelt comes in is kind of an interesting one. He came in because of the power production. What was going on was DuPont and Alcoa and several other companies wanted to build their own power dam, and they wanted to own it. And Roosevelt obviously was a big proponent of power development and ownership by whether it be the state or federal government, hence the creation of the Power Authority. So he was very much a proponent of it. It almost passed in the 30s. It almost passed in 1941 before the bombing of Pearl Harbor. But he also had been convinced by the Tennessee Valley Authority that this was a good move as well, that you could have not only a power dam that was state-run, but a system that was federally run. So he was very much a proponent of it, but it was just bad history. You know, one of the lectures that I give is about the political part of it. Every time they passed a bill, well, first it was World War I, then it was the Great Depression, then it was the bombing of Pearl Harbor, and then it was dealing with the aftermath of the war. So, but he's one of the major proponents of the Seaway, but particularly the power production, because we needed it before the Canadians did. So, yeah, he's in the book quite a bit. He sort of knew when to back off and knew when to support it. So.
No, I just wanted to, home is, originally for me, is Messina. I was there during the construction, and I was a tour guide at the power plant when Moses was the chairman. I started in, he left in 62, and I started in 60. Power Authority the power was created by, the power dam is state operated, while
yes.
the Seaway is federal in the Corps of Engineers.
Well, it's very interesting. Well, the Corps wanted to build it and run it, but they wouldn't let them because they wanted it to be a state thing. But I think it is one of the few state and federally not only constructed but run.
Yeah. I mean, just as soon as St. Lawrence was done at the power, that's when the Power Authority then went and built the Niagara project with that. Yeah.
Which was even, from my understanding, some of the workers I've spoken with, worse off than this one.
That's, well, most of them, a lot of them left from St. Lawrence and went to...
Yeah, they did, because the Canadians built Niagara Falls before the Seaway, their Niagara Falls project, and then we went after.
Well, after Niagara Mohawk, the power dam went into the gorge of the Niagara River.
That was amazing. That was a tragedy right there.
Oh yeah.
I don't think we would have done anything about it if it hadn't.
Oh, absolutely not. Yeah.
But I think many of the technology and the workers, what they learned on the Seaway, they could bring to that project because they'd done it before. Yeah. So it was very beneficial. And also, I mean, that whole thing with the state, federal, all of that, I still in my mind cannot figure out how they did it. Privilege of getting going up there. I got in there right before they shut it down. But that whole visitor center and the money and what Robert Moses put into even the conference room up there. But he's one of my favorite people. His life story that they wrote had a snippet. But you probably know his brother designed the Seaway.
Oh, I didn't know that.
But he never hired him.
No. I mean, it's just a shame. I mean, you talk about just the, New York State and Ontario Hydro was a shake. There was no signed agreement between the two of them when they built the power dam. They
just did it.
Moses was a tough operator.
He told everybody.
In today's world because
no, he was. They said that basically when people started complaining that he was taking the land away, all he had to do was write a letter to the governor and say, "I'm doing this," and the governor said, "Fine, you do whatever you need to do." And the best part about him was he would come up very infrequently. He had his lawyers, very famous lawyers that would deal with the claims and all of that. And he sort of showed up when something really needed to be taken care of. But their favorite story was they would create a dinner for him when he came up there. He would come in and use the bathroom, talk about how paper towels were, he had this thing about paper towels. So they were running around to get regular towels for him. Shows you how powerful he was. Then he would look at them and say, "Oh, hello, gentlemen, nice to see you. I'm going to go have dinner with Al Millette, his good friend." He said, "Nice to see all of you." And that's just the way he was. He was so feared, but he was also very much above it. He had to rely on his designers and his engineers and everybody else, but he was the one that made the decisions, like the monetary decisions, and he's the one who had the reputation. But the weird part about it, the story about his brother, was that his brother designed it for his employer. And he begged Robert Moses for a job. But what Robert Moses became famous for in his early career was fighting nepotism and fighting the political machines. So he never hired his brother at the Seaway or at Niagara Falls, and his brother died a pauper.
Welcome to Channel 17, the Town of Colonie Government Channel.